Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, we're examining one of the most sophisticated drone operations to target Russian territory since the conflict began. On November 8, 2025, a carefully orchestrated strike reached the outskirts of Moscow itself, demonstrating the evolving tactics in modern asymmetric warfare. The story begins several hours earlier that same day, when Russian forces launched a large-scale assault on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Around 6 in the evening, Moscow time, a wave of missiles and drones targeted power facilities across Ukraine, resulting in blackouts affecting multiple cities, including Kyiv, where residents experienced approximately 12 hours without electricity. The attack, estimated to have cost around $50 million in munitions, drew celebrations on Russian state media outlets, with broadcasters focusing heavily on Ukraine's infrastructure difficulties. What Russian defense planners didn't anticipate was that this strike would trigger an immediate and carefully planned response. Within hours, Ukrainian special operations teams, already positioned inside Russian territory, began final preparations for a mission that had likely been planned for weeks. The operation relied on a principle that's become central to Ukraine's defense strategy: using relatively inexpensive technology to force adversaries into wasteful defensive responses. The first phase launched around 10:45 that evening. A covert team, positioned roughly 15 miles from Moscow's city limits, deployed approximately 40 small first-person view drones from a concealed location. These drones, each costing an estimated $500, were deliberately designed to appear as amateur threats. Their flight patterns were intentionally crude, their electronic signatures unsophisticated. To trained Russian radar operators monitoring Moscow's air defense network, these targets would have appeared as a desperate, poorly coordinated assault. At exactly 11 o'clock, Moscow's outer defense perimeter detected the incoming swarm. The response was immediate, and, from a Ukrainian perspective, entirely predictable. Russia's S-400 air defense systems, considered among the most advanced in the world, are designed to engage high-value targets like strategic bombers and cruise missiles. Each interceptor missile costs several $1 million and travels at approximately 12 times the speed of sound. Operators, trained to respond decisively to any threat approaching the capital, authorized immediate engagement. Within minutes, approximately 20 of the small Ukrainian drones were destroyed. The S-400 missiles, each worth more than all 40 drones combined, effectively vaporized their targets. Russian operators likely felt confident they'd neutralized the threat efficiently. But from the Ukrainian command perspective, this was precisely the intended outcome. The first layer of Moscow's defense had just expended enormous resources, eliminating what were essentially decoys. The surviving drones continued their approach, now entering the engagement range of Russia's Pantsir S-1 systems. These mobile air defense platforms form Moscow's middle defensive layer, designed to engage targets that penetrate the outer perimeter. Here, Ukrainian operators implemented the operation's most sophisticated deception. Using electronic warfare techniques, they modified the radar signatures of the remaining drones, making each appear as a much larger, more threatening target. On Russian operators' screens, what had been small drones suddenly registered as potential cruise missiles or low-flying aircraft. The Pantsir systems, operating under protocols that prioritize rapid engagement over target verification, responded exactly as Ukrainian planners anticipated. Operators launched dozens of 9 M311 missiles, each costing approximately $80,000. In less than 90 seconds, the Pantsir batteries expended nearly half their available ammunition engaging targets that were either decoys or electronically spoofed signatures. As the last of these drones were eliminated, Moscow's mayor posted updates on social media declaring that air defenses had successfully repelled an unusual drone swarm attack. Russian defense officials likely believed they'd achieved a decisive victory, destroying an entire Ukrainian assault with minimal risk to the city itself. Their celebration, however, was premature. While Moscow's defenses were focused on the decoy swarm, a second wave of 60 much larger drones had been approaching along an entirely different route. These Lyuty-class drones, launched from staging areas in Ukraine's Sumy region approximately 2 hours earlier, had been flying low-altitude profiles, using terrain masking and navigating along oil pipeline corridors to avoid radar detection. They represented the actual strike force, while the first wave had served purely as a distraction designed to deplete defensive resources. As Pantsir crews were reloading their launchers, Russian air defense radars suddenly detected 60 new contacts approaching from the west. The realization in command centers must have been immediate and unsettling. The first wave hadn't been the main attack at all. It had been a diversion, and Moscow's most capable defensive systems had already expended significant ammunition on targets that ultimately didn't matter. With Pantsir systems still reloading, responsibility for engaging the second wave fell to shorter-range Tor M2 missile batteries, positioned closer to the city. These systems are highly effective within their operational range, and immediately began engaging the incoming drones. Unlike the first wave, these Lyuty drones employed sophisticated countermeasures, including mesh networking technology that allowed them to operate as a coordinated swarm rather than individual targets. As Tor systems launched, interceptors, Ukrainian drones scattered into randomized flight paths, each following independent trajectories while maintaining electronic communication with the others. Despite these countermeasures, Russian air defenses proved effective. One by one, the drones were intercepted. Within 2 minutes, 34 of the 60 drones had been destroyed, their wreckage falling across Moscow's western suburbs. At this critical moment, with the attack appearing to falter, Russian electronic warfare units deployed their most powerful asset, the Krasuka-4 system. This platform generates intense radio frequency interference, designed to sever the connection between drones and their operators. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Approximately 80% of the remaining Ukrainian drones lost contact with their ground controllers. Video feeds that had been transmitting real-time flight data dissolved into static. For the operators monitoring the mission from Ukraine, this represented the worst-case scenario they'd prepared for, but hoped to avoid. Russian electronic warfare officers, watching their screens, likely expected the blinded drones to lose coordination and either crash or scatter aimlessly. Instead, something remarkable occurred. The drones continued flying toward their targets in coordinated patterns. The mesh network technology that linked them together functioned autonomously, allowing the swarm to operate without external commands. Using last known GPS coordinates, internal gyroscopes, and sensor data shared between individual units, the drones maintained formation and continued their approach. This capability represents a significant evolution in drone warfare. Traditional remotely piloted systems become helpless when communications are jammed. These drones, however, had been designed to function as a distributed intelligence network, similar to how a flock of birds maintains cohesion without centralized control. Each drone acted as both an independent unit and part of a collective system, sharing information and adapting to circumstances in real time. Despite this resilience, the combination of missile fire and electronic warfare reduced the attacking force to just 6 drones by the time they reached Moscow's inner defensive perimeter. The final layer of defense consisted of 30mm automatic cannons, essentially Gatling guns, that create walls of projectiles rather than relying on guided missiles. 4 of the 6 remaining drones flew directly into these defensive barriers and were torn apart by cannon fire, their debris falling into forested areas near the suburb of Koptevo. 2 drones survived this final gauntlet, though both had sustained damage and were trailing smoke. They'd reached their designated targets, the fuel storage facilities at Sheremetyevo International Airport and the Transneft pipeline complex in Zelenograd. As these final 2 drones began their terminal approaches, the automatic cannon systems tracking them opened fire once more. Both drones were hit multiple times and disintegrated several hundred feet above their targets. For a moment, it appeared that Moscow's defenses had achieved a complete victory. 98 of 100 attacking drones had been destroyed. By conventional military metrics, this represented an overwhelming defensive success. What wasn't immediately apparent was that the drones' explosive warheads weren't the only danger they posed. At Sheremetyevo Airport, one of Russia's busiest international hubs, debris from the first destroyed drone impacted directly onto a primary pumping station, serving the airport's jet fuel storage tanks. The combination of kinetic impact, residual fuel in the drone itself, and the subsequent detonation of its 10-pound warhead triggered a fire at a critical choke point in the airport's refueling infrastructure. While not catastrophic, the fire immediately activated automated safety systems. Foam suppression systems engaged, emergency shut-off valves closed, and the entire refueling network went into lockdown mode. Simultaneously, approximately 20 miles away in Zelenograd, fragments from the second drone struck the Transneft pipeline hub, a critical junction that normally processes approximately 500,000 barrels of oil daily. The impact ruptured a secondary feed line, causing a leak that immediately ignited. The resulting fire, though contained to one section, triggered emergency protocols that shut down the entire pipeline segment for inspection and repair. The immediate consequences rippled outward. At Sheremetyevo, all flight operations were suspended for approximately 2 hours, while emergency crews addressed the fuel system fire and conducted safety inspections. This ground halt affected dozens of flights, with over 50 departures eventually canceled or diverted. The disruption cascaded through European air traffic networks for the following day as airlines struggled to reposition aircraft and accommodate stranded passengers. The psychological impact within Moscow itself proved equally significant. Air raid sirens, previously an abstract concern associated with a distant conflict, had sounded across residential suburbs. Videos of burning infrastructure circulated rapidly on social media, viewed millions of times within hours. The carefully maintained narrative that Moscow remained far from the conflict zone had been directly challenged. This wasn't the first time Ukrainian drones had reached Moscow. The previous year, a drone strike had actually impacted the Kremlin itself, prompting a massive investment in additional air defense systems. Rooftop installations of Pantsir batteries had appeared on government buildings throughout the capital. Officials had declared Moscow effectively impenetrable to aerial attack. This latest operation demonstrated that enhanced defenses could still be circumvented through tactical innovation rather than brute force. The economic calculations surrounding the operation reveal the mathematics of asymmetric warfare. Russia's initial strike on Ukrainian infrastructure consumed approximately $50 million in munitions. The subsequent defense of Moscow required an estimated $200 million worth of interceptor missiles, with additional costs from disrupted oil pipeline operations and airport downtime. The total Russian expenditure for these 24 hours likely approached $250 million. Ukrainian costs for the retaliatory operation, including the deployment of special forces teams, both drone waves and supporting infrastructure, totaled approximately $2 million. This represents a cost exchange ratio exceeding 100 to 1. A stark illustration of how technological innovation and tactical creativity can offset enormous disparities in military spending. International response to the operation proved significant. European Union officials, observing the demonstrated effectiveness of Ukraine's drone programs, announced additional funding commitments exceeding €1 billion specifically for unmanned systems development. Military analysts globally began reassessing assumptions about the vulnerability of heavily defended strategic targets to swarm tactics. The operation illuminates several evolving principles of 21st century conflict. Traditional measures of military power, such as the sophistication and cost of defensive systems, no longer guarantee security against determined adversaries employing innovative tactics. The Russian air defenses performed largely as designed, achieving a 98% interception rate. Yet, the operation succeeded because its objectives never required most of the drones to reach their targets. The goal was strategic disruption and psychological impact, both achieved despite overwhelming defensive firepower. The swarm's autonomous capabilities demonstrated another emerging reality. As electronic warfare systems become more sophisticated, the ability of unmanned systems to operate independently of human control becomes increasingly valuable. The mesh networking technology that allowed the drones to maintain coordination despite jamming represents a significant evolution in autonomous systems, with implications extending far beyond this single operation. The deliberate depletion of defensive ammunition through decoy waves showcases the vulnerability of even well-resourced militaries to tactical innovation. Moscow's air defense network performed its designated function, but the sheer volume of targets and the multi-layered deception overwhelmed standard operating procedures. Operators trained to respond decisively to threats approaching the capital did exactly that, not realizing until too late that their decisive responses were precisely what the attackers intended. The operation's success in reaching its objectives despite a 98% attrition rate challenges conventional military thinking about acceptable loss ratios. In traditional warfare, such casualties would represent catastrophic failure. In this context, where the drones were relatively inexpensive and their primary purpose was partly to absorb defensive fire, the same statistics represented strategic success. Looking forward, this operation will likely influence drone warfare doctrine globally. The demonstrated viability of using low-cost decoys to deplete expensive defensive systems creates powerful incentives for similar tactics elsewhere. Air defense planners now face the challenge of distinguishing genuine threats from sophisticated decoys without expending finite ammunition on every detected target. The proliferation of autonomous swarm technologies makes this challenge increasingly difficult. For Moscow's civilian population, the operation shattered any remaining illusion of immunity from the broader conflict. The sound of air raid sirens and the sight of burning infrastructure inside the city limits transformed abstract geopolitical tensions into immediate personal reality. This psychological dimension, impossible to quantify in military terms, may ultimately prove as significant as the physical damage inflicted. The events of November 8, 2025 provide a case study in how innovation, careful planning, and tactical deception can achieve strategic objectives against numerically and technologically superior opposition. The operation succeeded not through overwhelming force, but through understanding and exploiting the predictable responses of highly capable defensive systems. In an era where military technology advances rapidly and conflicts increasingly involve asymmetric adversaries, such lessons become relevant far beyond this single engagement. That's our analysis for tonight. Thank you for watching.